Welcome to Salon Talks. My name is Ashlie Stevens, and I am here today with Erin Jeanne McDowell. She is a cookbook author, she's a recipe developer, she's an award-winning food stylist, and her latest book is Savory Baking, Recipes for Breakfast, Dinner, and Everything in Between. Erin, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I wanted to start at the beginning of your book, the introduction fittingly. And as I was reading through, I really kind of saw myself there because you talk about how at around the age of 16, you really fell in love with baking and savory baking in particular. And I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about what drew you to baking and maybe some of the stuff that you kind of like first got into doing in the kitchen.
Yes, well, it's funny, I don't really remember a time that I wasn't baking. Food was a big part of my family and a big part of growing up. My mom was an extremely good cook and baker, and I think she was a fan of kitchen projects, with kids and having that kind of occupy an afternoon. So definitely the thing that I made the most at the beginning was cookies. I was a big cookie machine. Both I liked icing cookies, I liked, drop cookies, all of that stuff. And then um at Christmas time we would do gingerbread houses from a really, really young age. And that's still kind of a tradition to this day in my family. So food and being around food and being in the kitchen definitely from a really young age. When I started doing things more on my own, I was a teenager and a little bit out of interest of learning to make things for myself and a little bit out of um wanting that experimentation to continue and enjoying spending time in the kitchen and it being a fun way to pass time. So it was about 14 years old when I started making pies with my grandma. And it was something that we would do, not always pies, actually. We also sometimes baked a loaf of bread, but we would bake together and play cards while the dough was rising or the pie dough was chilling or while things were baking. And I really that's when I really fell in love with it more, was during that time. And I got my first job in a bakery when I was 16. So it spurned, an excitement that I couldn't quite shake.
Well, I should have noted in the introduction that you are kind of the pie queen as well. It was your recipe for pie dough that made me confident enough to try in my own kitchen. So
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much. I mean, honestly, one of the things that I think is so funny, don't get me wrong, like 14-year-old me loves being called the queen of anything. Like that is really an exciting thing for me. But at the same time, my whole thing with pie is really that I feel like I want more people to make it. And I feel like so many people were scared of it. So the biggest compliment someone can give me is that I've made them confident enough to make pie because really, I just want there to be as much pie in the world as possible. I want there to be 100 pie queens, a million pie queens, and kings all.
everyone, pie people.
Let them eat pie.
So there was a line in your book that I was hoping you could expand on because I thought it was really, really interesting. And you wrote, that's what I really love most about savory baking. It combines the pleasure and precision of pastry with the freedom and flexibility of cooking. What did you mean by that?
Well, for me, the precision of baking really is almost a comfort. And I know that people who like to bake, I think, share this also. It can be really stressful for people who don't enjoy that precision part. But for me, what I love about a baking recipe is if it's well written and everything, you should be able to follow it, and you should end up with a result that is, similar to what the goal was there. And that isn't entirely true for me with cooking. I feel like cooking is such an adventure where it's not always about following a recipe. It's about following your taste buds and on all of these things. So for me, savory baking is this like imperfect intersection of the two, where I can still enjoy some of the rules of baking and some of the science behind it, but also there is this freedom and flexibility and ability to make it your own and add a pinch of this and a little bit of that the way you do in cooking. And I find both immensely pleasurable, but for me, where they meet is also a really fun place creatively for bakers. And that's something that I'm always trying to do is remind people that even though, yes, we need to follow these baking rules, yes, the goal would be to follow the recipe with some precision, if you understand what's going on behind a recipe and you understand a little bit of what's making it work, you suddenly can become a lot more flexible and a lot more creative. And that's something that I'm always really trying to share with people. So that's what I love about savory baking, is it's a lot easier to do that than it is, to just completely wing a pie out of nowhere. That's possible too, but it's kind of its own thing. But to be able to tweak some of these savory flavors, that's a lot more doable.
Well, so that actually ties into my next question. I was hoping to kind of nerd out a little bit on the process of making this book because it's so beautifully put together. And I
Thank
was just
you.
curious, like, what did the recipe research and development look like? And how did you kind of whittle that down into, okay, these are the recipes that I want to organize in this book together and share with other people?
It's the process of making a book for me is truly, I mean, it's part of why I do it. I love making books. I think it is so much fun and such a creative expression from beginning to end. I find the early parts of it very stressful, but because it's sort of solitary, the further you get along into the process, the more you're working with other people. People are testing the recipes and people are photographing them and tasting them. And then you bring in the editors and, then there's all of these other exciting kind of collaborative parts of it. But the early part, it's just me sitting in a room deciding what should be in a book. And I find that process so incredibly exciting and also incredibly stressful because I really want my books to be well rounded and have kind of a really effortless assortment. Of course, it's not effortless at all. It's very well thought out, but I want there to be an assortment of seasonality, an assortment of difficulty levels. I want there to be some projects for sure, but I also want there to be things that you can, make really easy on a weeknight. So it's, there's lots of questions that I ask myself, and sometimes I sort of start with this like board of loose concepts. Like, for example, in this book, I knew that I wanted to really highlight different forms of savory pancakes and crepes and some things that maybe people don't inherently think of as savory. So at first, I don't even have a specific flavor written down. It's just like, I know there needs to be a crepe in here, and what will that crepe be? And then eventually, as it gets filled out, the pieces sort of tend to fit themselves together. Seasonality and ingredients is something that really guides me a lot. I like there to be, it's always difficult. This book came out in the fall, and I feel like it even has like a fall like look to it. But obviously, I want there to be things that you keep making into winter and into spring and into summer. I want there to be, some evergreen nature to the book. So, yeah, it's a really, really exciting process, that beginning part. And for me, I just like to make sure that there's, not a lot of repetition. Like, I remember at one point I searched for a flavor concept. Like, it was something like pizza or
Mm.
pepperoni or something like that. I searched the manuscript for that and it appeared too many times. I was like, whoa, I went all in on the Roni. I need to back off a little bit. But then that's also like another way that ideas kind of work themselves out, is being like, oh man, I need more vegetables, or I need more of this, I need more of that. And that was another thing that I really thought about with this book. My last book, the book on pie, was easy to make gluten-free, because as long as I had a good gluten-free dough, many of the fillings are naturally gluten-free. So I had this kind of naturally inclusive book. Well, I had to work a little bit harder to make this one inclusive. And while it won't make absolutely everyone happy, there's a ton of vegetarian variations and a ton of easy swaps if something isn't vegetarian. So I really wanted it to resemble something that could appeal to a lot of people that are looking for something savory to bake, and also hopefully inspire people to think outside the box, that savory baking isn't just quiche and pizza, which are wonderful, but there's more to it than that.
So speaking of outside the box, I was flipping through, and a recipe that stopped me in my tracks the first flip through was the Italian Sub Bundt, which just I'm already planning when I go home and see family for the holidays. I'm like, okay, I need to break that out because I think everybody's going to find it so fun. Could you talk about the development of that recipe in particular?
Yeah, that is a fun one because my parents actually test a lot of my recipes with me. So that's it's been a really special thing. They started with my first book, The Fearless Baker, a little less testing on the book on pie, just because pies can be so finicky. But they really worked hard on this book with me as well. And they loved that recipe. And I knew if they loved it, that we had something kind of special on our hands. That was something I was trying to think of. How can we take a bundt pan, something that we normally think of for cake? Obviously, sometimes people do also make yeast raised breads in it or monkey bread or things like that. But I really want to be able to think of baking equipment that you already have that you enjoy using for sweet purposes and remind you that just because you enjoy making something sweet doesn't mean that you can't also bake a savory pie in that pie pan or, some kind of savory cake in that springform pan. There's lots of things that can kind of be going on in the kitchen. So that one really actually started from the concept of how do I use this bundt pan. And one of the things that I love about a bundt pan is that it provides portion markings for you. So for something like a sandwich and something where a 3 foot long sub actually isn't really that practical of a party food because you have to cut it all up and everybody get whatever. But in this case, we can build it in sort of a wedge sandwich situation. And what you get when you slice along those bundt lines is something like a little more resemblant of, for me, I think the filling to bread ratio is spot on. And it's easy to eat. So for me, that was a really fun example also of reimagining something pretty classic like a party sub, but trying to take it to a new place.
That's really smart. So something I was curious about reading through is, let's say that there are some beginner bakers out there who are like, all right, you know what, this is my time. I'm going to get into savory baking, but maybe they're looking to sort of stock up their pantry so they can have stuff on hand that they can pull from. What are some pantry staples that you would recommend folks who are going to make like a real run at savory baking? What should they keep around?
I think one of the best things that you can do is keep a well-stocked spice cabinet because that really comes into play in multiple ways. We can flavor doughs that we might normally think of as sweeter, or even just they might not actually have any sugar in them, but we might equate them with desserts, like even a pastry dough, a puff pastry dough. Obviously, there's so many savory things we can do with that. And by just adding some dried spices to it, we can also add a ton of savory flavor. And those are shelf stable. So some of the ones I use the most in this book, smoked paprika plays a really big role in this book. I love it for adding a little bit of the depth of a smoky flavor, obviously, but also I come from a family, one of my brother's ex-girlfriends accused us of putting paprika on everything. My whole family loves paprika. So
I love that it's an accusation.
yeah, she's accused us of putting paprika on just about everything. I also come from the Midwest, and I really love the use of like onion and garlic powder to boost allium flavor in something. And I think a lot of people sometimes can look down their nose at that a little bit, that it's like not fresh. But there's a time and a place for fresh onions and garlic, and there's also, I feel like, a time and a place for that artificial, or it's not even artificial, it's real. But I mean for the dried product,
Agree.
because in baking, whenever we can add something that's dry, we don't even really have to adjust the recipe at all. Whereas when we're adding something with moisture, it could actually really change things. So I think a well-stocked spice cabinet is another great place to go. And a few others that I really love that I used in this book, like Vaudevilles curry, which is a really oniony, mild curry. But also I think I used like a lot of jerk seasoning and a lot of spicy things like cayenne. And I also used a lot of flaky salt and a lot of coarsely ground black pepper, which I think black pepper is underappreciated as a flavor in and of itself. And so there's a lot of like black pepper finishes in this book. But anyway, I think a spice cabinet would be a great place to start. And when you're looking for one other thing that'll up the ante, cheese.
There we go. You're preaching to the choir at this point, but I completely agree. Um, so speaking of beginners, I found this book very accessible sort of across the board. But let's say that somebody's coming in, no experience, and they're looking for sort of a low stress way to move their way into savory baking, is there a particular recipe that you would point them to as like, this is kind of the foundation from which you can build upon?
Definitely. I mean, it's actually, I'm so bad also at picking just one recipe because it's like picking your favorite child. But I actually designed the book intentionally that the first two chapters are really the easiest places to start. So anything from chapter one or chapter two is really going to be a great place to get your feet wet, even if you're a total beginner. But I also found that a lot of really seasoned, experienced home bakers were diving into that chapter too, because as you mentioned, a lot of those recipes are really easy and accessible. They're weeknight friendly, and they also have a lot of flexibility to them to make them your own. So I think it's not only a great introduction into baking, there's recipes like the cornbread that don't even need a mixer. You can just mix it right in a bowl. I love to suggest people make buttermilk biscuits because they usually think that they're way harder to make than they are. If that seems too scary, there's also my drop biscuits, which are so simple and easy to make. So there's a lot of choices in those first couple of chapters, but also a lot of ability to make them your own. You know, make cheesy chive biscuits or make, spicy. I have this whole section on using different flavored butters to baste and add flavor. So, add garlic butter or maple butter to something like a corn muffin or a cornbread. There's so many options, and I feel like that's a really good place to start. And I wanted people to be able to open the book and see things in the very first pages that they could jump right into making, and that they might even have the ingredients on hand to make, or at least make a customized version to suit them.
That makes a lot of sense. And you brought up weeknight recipes, and that was something else that I really loved about this book. And I'm excited for people to read it because, in addition to some project recipes or ones that are like real sort of like showstoppers, there was stuff that I was flipping through, and I'm like, end of the day, I could absolutely make this and feed myself and my family. And what were some of your favorite weeknight recipes, or what are some of the ones that you do in your own kitchen when you're feeling sort of busy or stressed?
Well, one of the ones that I love to make because it's so simple, but feels like so much effort and love and care has gone into it when I finally put it on the table is the weeknight focaccia, which actually has the weeknight in the name. It's called weeknight focaccia because it only takes a few minutes to mix it by hand, and then it sits overnight. So the idea is you can do that on any weeknight, or on a lazy weekend is also great. But it really takes any meal that I'm making into this, wow, and I also made homemade bread kind of place. Some of the other ones that I turn to probably the most are the thick, chewy noodles for soup, especially this time of year. I'm battling kind of coming off the back end of a flu. And so I have been eating so much soup, and those thick, chewy noodles are so easy to make. They remind me of something my mom made for me growing up. And I think people think of making fresh pasta or fresh noodles as being a very time consuming, intimidating thing. But these are so simple. They don't even have to be totally the same size, very rustic, very simple. Um, Another one that I think might surprise people at how weeknight friendly it is the lamajun, which is in chapter 4. Um, this is also kind of goes by other names, like I've heard people kind of refer to it as like a Turkish pizza, though it's kind of far from being a pizza. It's a very, very thin dough. And then you take a spread of ground meat that's been seasoned right on the top. Because it's so thin, it only takes a few moments to cook. The recipe makes 6. It honestly, it comes together like that, but it's a very impressive, pretty amazing thing to bring to the table. And I finish it with lemon juice and parsley or other fresh herbs. And then I love to finish it with pickled chilies also, add a little spice to it. So that's another one that we make all the time. And even I remember one time I said, oh, I'll make lamajun for dinner. And someone was like, and you're going to start that now? And they couldn't believe when I was pulling them out of the oven, not too long after.
So we are shifting into the holiday season, or I guess we're in full swing holiday
We're
season.
knee deep in it. Yeah.
Right. We are here. So in addition to the Italian Sub Bundt, I already identified a couple other recipes that I'm planning on taking home. So there's the smoked salmon breakfast buns and the savory monkey bread. What other sort of recipes do you point to in the book as maybe fun to serve up around the holidays?
Well, one of the best chapters to go to is chapter 5, which is the bites chapter. There are so many little handheld appetizery, snacky sorts of things in there. One thing that I like to encourage people to try to do is make your own crackers, and the spicy, cheesy crackers are really delicious and very addictive. It can feel kind of intimidating to make something like that, but again, the yield is really huge, so it's great for making for gifts. And also, you can cut them into fun shapes this time of year. It's like, kind of a fun thing to do. You can pair it with, a cheese or charcuterie board where you don't have to necessarily do any cooking for the rest of that. So it's like a nice thing to do. I'm also really into a lot of the things that are wrapped in puff pastry, like the brie bites with pepper jelly, which I just did an episode of Bake It Up a Notch on that also, so people can check that out. That recipe is available online as well as in the book. The jalapeno pastry poppers, which is like if a jalapeno popper was wrapped in puff pastry. I had to like get close to you to say that because they're really so good. And there's just so many things like that in those chapters that are like, also I feel like hopefully will spark ideas for people. There's mini quiche and lots of mini bite-sized things that I think are so fun this time of year, and also things that refresh pretty well so that you can make them ahead and not be necessarily wrapping lots of things in puff pastry while your family is hanging out.
Makes sense. Pulling back from the book a little bit and just kind of more broadly, I was curious how you approach cooking and baking for groups, because I think that's on a lot of people's minds right now. And I was just curious if you had any tips for amateur bakers as they're getting ready to have family and friends over for the holidays.
Well, one of the biggest pieces of advice, and I feel like everybody says this, but don't make something for the first time when you're having friends and family over, because it's just too stressful and it takes away the most enjoyable part of it for me. I love to think about things that can be made ahead when I'm having friends and family over. And what's so great about Savory Baking is so many things can be made ahead because they're baked. Unless it really needs to be served warm, like maybe the monkey bread, which is so wonderful to serve warm. A lot of things, even the savory pies, I recommend them cooling completely. Most of the breads, I recommend them cooling completely, though who can resist warm bread? And I will not be judging you if you just tear into that bread while it's warm. But yeah, I think that there's definitely a lot of possibility when you simplify things a little bit. So picking a few things that can be made ahead. In my book, I have these instructions of make ahead and storage, how things can be stored, even how they can be refreshed in some cases, so that you know kind of what exactly you can make ahead. And pairing that in some cases with things that do take some of the effort off your plate, like a great cheese plate, or like maybe buying the dessert from your favorite bakery so that you're not having to, bend over and do a million different things. But that said, making a list for yourself, kind of planning out what you can do ahead. The real difference between professionals and people at home is that in restaurants, we're always prepping 1, 2, even 3 days ahead. So that's where some of that flavor comes from, because we might start marinating something 2 days before we're actually going to cook it. We're going to, all of these different things. So when you make yourself a list around the holidays like that, it actually sometimes becomes really obvious, like, oh man, I can do all these things 3 days ahead. And then I only have these 5 things I have to do 2 days ahead. And it just kind of breaks it out in a really nice way.
Fantastic. That's great advice all around. Again, Erin Jeanne McDowell, her latest cookbook is Savory Baking, Recipes for Breakfast, Dinner, and Everything in Between. Erin, thanks again for joining us at Salon Talks.
Thank you so much. It was so much fun.